Welcome to the Journal. There were hands in the air in Washington this week, but it wasn't a stick-up. The new Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, appointed by Congress to find out how America got rolled, began hearings this week. These four are not the victims of one of the greatest bank heists in history. They're the perpetrators, bankers so sleek and crafty they got off with the loot in broad daylight and then sweet-talked the government into taxing us to pay it back. Watching that scene on the opening day of the hearings, it was hard enough to believe that almost a year has passed since Barack Obama raised his hand too, taking the oath of office to become our 44th president. Even harder to remember what America looked like before Obama, because we've not only been robbed of our money, we've been robbed of memory. Assaulted by what the Nobel laureate Chesley Milosz described as a fantastic proliferation of mass media, we live in a time characterized by a refusal to remember. Inconvenient facts simply disappear down the memory hole, as in George Orwell's novel, 1984. President Obama now has made plenty of mistakes during his first year, and we've critiqued them frequently here on the Journal. But hardly anyone talks anymore about what happened in the years before Obama. He inherited from George W. Bush the biggest financial debacle since the Great Depression, along with two unpopular and costly wars and a dysfunctional and demoralized government. So it's important to remember those years, a time that has been characterized by the historian Thomas Frank as a low, dishonest decade. He's here to talk about them with me. Thomas Frank is editor of the recently relaunched Baffler magazine, a literary journal. He's a contributing editor of Harper's, a weekly columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and the author of One Market Under God, the best-selling What's the Matter with Kansas, and his latest bestseller, The Wrecking Crew, now out in paperback. Good to have you back.
It's my pleasure, Bill.
How is it that the people who are responsible for the mess that Obama inherited are getting away with demonizing him when he's only had less than a year to clean it up? Let me show you just a sample of right-wing commentators railing against the president.
President Obama and the Democrats are destroying the U.S. economy. They are purposely doing it, I believe.
This is a well-thought-out plan to collapse the economy as we know it.
The president has, I think if you listen to what he says, a hatred for capitalism. Where do jobs come from? They don't come from the government. They come from the profit-seeking self-interest that, from what I hear and see, the president never misses an opportunity to smear and slap.
This guy is a coward. He does not have the gonads or the spine to even stand up and accept what he's doing. All of this is his doing. He cannot even proudly say, you should like this. You may not like it, but I'm telling you it's the best thing for you. It's the best thing for me. No, he knows it's a disaster. He has to slough this off on his previous or his predecessor, the previous administration.
It's his stimulus. It's his record deficit spending. He quadrupled the debt in a year. You know, how many more times are Democrats going to say, oh, it's George Bush's fault? This is Obama's economy now.
What goes through your mind as a historian when you watch that?
Well, that is America for you. I mean, that is the sort of the demented logic of our politics, is that now Obama's been president for a year, and he will come before the public in the fall, you know, having to defend all of these terrible things. But that's how our politics works in this country.
But you called it demented. I mean, you know, demented means crazy,
yeah.
mad and crazy enough to cause us to forget the world before Obama?
I'll give you an example of what I mean. So I was on a radio show the other day with a Tea Party leader, you know, one of these protest leaders. And he seemed like a good guy, but what he did say that struck me was he said he was really against monopoly, you know, and we're laboring under all these monopolies, all this concentrated power here in America, and what we need to do is get back to free markets. And then we can do away with that. And it was mind-blowing, because if you look back any further than the Obama administration, since, 1980, in this country, we have been in the grip of, of this pursuit of ever purer free markets. That's what American politics has been about. That's what has delivered this, the awful circumstances that we find ourselves in today. And to think that that's what's missing, that's what we need to get back to, is
more than nostalgia. What is that?
Well, that's the disease of our time. That's, that sort of instant forgetting.
But what does it do to our politics when the very spokesman for what some people have called a decade of conservative failure. I mean, remember before Obama, they turned the budget surplus into a deficit. Mm-hmm. They took us to war on fraudulent pretenses. Mm-hmm. They borrowed money to fight it. They presided over a stalemate in Afghanistan. They trashed the Constitution. They presided over the weakest economy in decades.
Not weak for everybody.
No.
So some people did really well.
Okay, they compiled the worst track record on jobs in decades, and they ended up with the worst stock market in decades. I mean, it was a decade of conservative failure, and yet Obama's their villain.
Well, think of all the crises and the disasters that you've described, and I would add to them things like what happened in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and the Madoff scandal on Wall Street, and on and on. The Jack Abramoff scandal, the whole sordid career of Tom DeLay, all of these things that we remember from the last decade. I mean, some of them that we're forgetting, like who remembers all the scandals over earmarking anymore? And who remembers all the scandals over Iraq reconstruction, all the disastrous, when we would hand it off to a private contractor to rebuild Iraq and it would, of course it would fail. Those things have all sort of been dwarfed by the economic disaster and the wreckage on Wall Street. But I would say to you that all of these things that we are describing here are of a piece, and that they all flow from the same ideas. And those ideas are the sort of conservative attitude towards government and conservative attitudes towards governance. Okay?
That government is a perversion.
Government is government is a perversion, and to believe that the federal government can be operated, with all of its programs, can be operated well and do things that are good for the people is, as you say, is a perversion. And they look at someone like Barack Obama, and it makes them seethe, because that's what he's trying to do. What conservatism in this country is about is government failure. Conservatives talk about government failure all the time, constantly, and conservatives, when they're in power, deliver government failure.
Not merely from incompetence, you say, but from ideology, from philosophy, from a view of the world. And sometimes
from design.
From design. What do you mean?
Not always from design, but often. The Department of Labor, for example. The conservatives, when they get in office, routinely stuff the Department of Labor full of ideological cranks and people that don't believe in the mission. And the result is that they don't enforce anything. Towards the very end of the Bush era, the Department of Labor had been whittled down. It was a shell of its former self. And at the very end of the Bush administration, one of the government accountability programs did a study of the Department of Labor, and I'm smiling because it's kind of amusing. It was like an old Spy magazine prank. They made up these horrendous labor violations around the country and phoned them in as complaints to the Department of Labor to see what they would do. Okay? They responded to 1 out of 10 of these, we're like they called in as like, well, we got kids working at a meat packing plant during school hours. Can you going to do anything about that? No. Or you look at something like the Securities and Exchange Commission. Okay, these guys are supposed to be regulating the investment banks. Okay, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, that sort of thing. These guys were so underfunded. And not just underfunded, but you had people in charge of it who didn't believe in regulating Wall Street.
Yeah, they made the Securities and Exchange Commission a laughingstock, if you will. They really did.
Well, there's these horrible stories that came out. Once Bush was out, there was a study done of the SEC as well. These people didn't even have their own functioning photocopiers, okay? So we're talking about the lawyers that are supposed to be protecting us from Wall Street, and they have to go stand in line at Kinko's to do their own photocopying. And they're going up against the best paid, best educated lawyers on planet Earth who represent the investment banks, and they're supposed to be defending us.
The curious thing about this is that you and I and my audience knows that our ancestors believed that capitalism needed to be supervised. But when the conservatives came to power, they began to muzzle the watchdog.
Yeah. Well, or do away with it altogether, defund it. Look, beginning in the 1980s, you had President Reagan came to power, and you remember the kind of rhetoric that he used to use in denouncing the federal workforce. He hated the federal workforce, and this is an article of faith among conservatives. There's something called the pay gap that they used to talk about a lot in Washington, D.C., which is that back in the 50s, 60s, and up into the 1970s, federal workers were paid a comparable amount to what people in the private sector earned. Okay, so if you're a lawyer working for the government, you got about as much as a lawyer working in the private sector. Not as much, because government benefits are considered to be much better. Okay. Under Reagan, you had this huge gap open up between federal workers and the private sector. I asked around and I found out a government attorney makes $140,000 a year on retirement after he's been there all his life. In the private sector law firm in Washington, you'd be making $160 starting salary. That's first year, right out of law school.
So what's the consequence of this pay gap you described? Oh, do we get inferior government because of it?
Absolutely. It keeps the best and the brightest out of government service, unless you're really dedicated to a cause. But let me go one step further with this bill. When I say this is done by design, I'm not exaggerating. And this is one of the more surprising things that I found when I was doing the